Aidan Bailey.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and can I thank the Honourable Lady for her speech and say how sobering it is listening to those stories. And can I join with my honourable friend from Stafford in paying tribute to the families and the loved ones from both Stafford and Cannock who had appalling care, and praise them for their strength in telling their stories. And I will fight with my honourable friend for Stafford against any serious downgrade of Stafford Hospital, and more importantly from my perspective against any possible closure of Cannock Hospital, which is managed by the same trust. And I note that the Support Stafford Hospital has been launched by the Staffordshire newsletter today, and I'm sure we will both be supporting that campaign. Mr Deputy Speaker, this motion calls for accountability and transparency within the NHS. And in relation to Mid-Staff's Trust, I think there are three areas that need the most accountability and transparency. And that is around the granting of Foundation Trust status to that trust in 2009. It's about the opposition to a public inquiry into what went on. And it's about the targets at all costs culture. And I want to deal with each of these in turn today. Firstly, Mr Deputy Speaker, we have the indignity and the embarrassment now of Mid-Staffordshire Foundation Trust being abolished by Monitor, just 5 years after becoming a foundation trust. And I want members to think about that for a second. Just 5 years ago, it was considered so outstanding, such an exemplar of compassionate care and sound finances, that the member for Lee awarded it foundation trust status on the 1st of February 2008.
Would it give way?
Of course.
Can I just correct the honourable gentleman, Mr Deputy Speaker? I wasn't a minister in the Department of Health on the 1st of February 2008. And can I also say to him that the awarding of Foundation Trust status was a responsibility of Monitor, not of ministers in the department?
The second point, I believe he's incorrect. I believe it is the Secretary of State who signs off the awarding of Foundation Trust status, but I accept it was his honourable friend, the member for Hull, behind him and not himself. But we know that he admitted to the public inquiry that he looked at just 4 lines of civil service evidence about FT status before signing it off. And I do have to ask, is that actually good enough for a Secretary of State? Why didn't he look at it in more detail? Was he just not really bothered? Because I think that that is a dereliction of his public duty to ensure public health in Staffordshire, and he should have the decency to apologise to the people in the gallery from my constituency and my honourable friend's constituency who've come down today. Or was it signed off because of the culture of targets at any cost under the last government? Was organisational form, foundation trust status, whatever that means, actually more important than patient care? We know locally that they wanted to prove their foundation trust policy was a success, and that actually took priority over what it really meant for patients and their care. But don't believe me, here's what a Mid-Staffordshire Foundation Trust non-executive said just this week in a public meeting in Rugeley in my constituency. Our problems started when they made 200 nurses redundant in 2008 to achieve an acceptable financial footing for foundation status. But care standards then slipped thereafter, and by 2009 we had a £2 million deficit. Mr Deputy Speaker, everybody knows that huge pressure was put on David Nicholson by his political masters to have a foundation trust in the West Midlands, and poor little Mid-Staffordshire was the one that got forced through. So in the interest of accountability and transparency that this motion calls for, I want to see an apology for forcing through foundation trust status at a time when people were dying from appalling care and the trust was going bankrupt. But it's not just politicians. If anybody is in any doubt about how ingrained the targets culture had become, I have found an old press release from Mid-Staffordshire Trust that had actually been taken off their website, but is still findable if you look around on the internet. This is their press release from the 3rd of October 2002. A baby's service of remembrance. A short service of remembrance for those whose babies have died in the past few years is being held in the Pilgrim Chapel at Stafford General Hospital. Just 7 days later, good news from Mid-Staffordshire General Hospital Trust. Chairman David O'Neill is delighted to announce the Trust has been shortlisted to the last 3 for the National Partnership Industry Award for our bed management system. It is absolutely astonishing, this culture, Mr Deputy Speaker, and it simply has to change. We've now had the public inquiry, and Robert Francis has laid out in full gory detail the horrendous failings at Stafford Hospital. And you might have thought that with what went wrong there would have been cross-party support for a public inquiry. but not. And I presume, Mr Deputy Speaker, that members opposite now support the Francis inquiry and its findings. There were certainly many Labour MPs at the all-party health group meeting with Robert Francis this Tuesday. But I want to know how many of them were among the 260 Labour MPs who voted against a Commons motion calling for a public inquiry on the 18th of May 2009. The facts, and they might be uncomfortable facts for the honourable gentleman, is that Labour ignored 81 requests for a full public inquiry into mid-staffs between January 2009 and May 2010. They received 20 letters from MPs, 36 from members of the public and from 25 organisations. They ignored the families who protested outside the Department of Health for a public inquiry, including Cure the NHS. And the member for Lee, as he's already said in his comments today, rejected a full public inquiry on the grounds that it would, quote, distract the management. Does he now accept that that judgment was wrong? He's welcome to intervene on me and tell me whether he accepts his judgment that it would be a distraction was now wrong.
I need to ask him, will he acknowledge that I commissioned Robert Francis to conduct 2 independent inquiries into what happened? I think he needs to acknowledge that it wasn't that I wasn't doing anything. And can I also say, I made that judgment because I wanted to get to the truth of what happened, at the same time as not overburdening the hospital with the job of getting better. I tried to strike that balance, and that is why I reached the judgments that I did.
I'll accept, I think what everybody else in this House will accept, that he's refused to answer the question again. He will not say whether that judgment was a mistake. And until he does, I don't think we can take what he says seriously. Here's what the then Health Secretary, the member for Hull West, said, who joined in the refusal to have a full public inquiry. He said to the Birmingham Post on the 19th of March 2009, "I really don't think, with the greatest respect, that a public inquiry is going to take us any further forward." Will he now intervene on me and tell me, will he be writing to the Birmingham Post to tell us whether it has taken us any further forward? He can scowl across the chamber, but I'm afraid that is no answer and people will listen to that. Mr Deputy Speaker, in the interests of accountability and transparency, we need to know why the then Labour government opposed a full public inquiry into mid-Staffordshire. Why were they so afraid of finding out the truth of what went on? Is it really that important to protect the reputation of the NHS as an institution rather than to protect the patients that it serves and who ultimately pay for it? Finally, Mr Deputy Speaker, there are now abounding claims and counterclaims about Stafford and Cannock Hospital as a result of the indignity of having our Foundation Trust abolished. And you'd have thought, after forcing through Foundation Trust status and opposing a public inquiry, that locally Labour would have some contrition, but sadly not. The Labour leader of my local council and the prospective Labour parliamentary candidate for Cannock Chase are now teaming up to fight plans, quote, they feel are aimed at privatising Cannock Hospital. The leader of the council said he was launching a petition against being a victim of Tory privatisation plans. Mr Deputy Speaker, there are no plans in the Monitor report to privatise Cannock Hospital. So I want to know whether the local Labour Party are getting their information from. In fact, as a result of the FT status, there are already private providers in Cannock Hospital operating out of them. And I noticed that there were no protests from the Labour councillors when private healthcare facilities were introduced into Cannock Hospital. So again, in the interests of accountability and transparency in the NHS, I call on the Labour frontbench to stop their parliamentary candidates and their council leaders scaremongering local people for political ends. Mr Deputy Speaker, you cannot fight privatisation if there are no plans to privatise anything. You cannot start a petition to save Cannock Hospital if the Monitor report suggests making it a centre of excellence for orthopaedic elective surgery in the West Midlands. You cannot oppose a public inquiry and then welcome all of its findings. You can't force through Foundation Trust status just for its own sake, rather than what it will achieve for patients. And if you do so, and it has the reverse, perverse effect of causing appalling care, unnecessary deaths, and bankrupting the trust, which has to be abolished just 5 years later, you should be man enough to apologise. I agree we need to be more accountable and transparent, but that starts from the top, from the Secretaries of State, down to the bottom, to the local council leaders and their parliamentary candidates.